I am recording right now. Let's just do some introductions first. I'm Zahid.
I'm Elliot. If you want to introduce yourself.
Meet you both.
Do you want to introduce yourself and your experience working with Bigfoot or in the
Sure.
field?
Well, I'm Dr. Jeff Meldrum. I'm a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, where I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs. I research the evolution of human bipedalism and vertebrate, especially primate functional morphology, more broadly and generally than that even. But that's sort of the focus that served as the nexus for my interest in Sasquatch. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I was introduced to the subject of Sasquatch when Roger Patterson came to Spokane, Washington, and showed his film when I was about 11 years old. And subsequently, though I pursued a career in physical anthropology, as I said, with an emphasis in in bipedalism. And so it was that, the notion that there might actually be another bipedal hominin still on the planet. What an interesting discovery that would be. What an interesting natural experiment of comparison and contrast with our own condition. And so that's how my interest, and also that is why my interest has largely focused on the footprint evidence. Not only is that the most prolific, the most ubiquitous evidence that we have, really, objective evidence beyond eyewitness encounter descriptions, but it deals directly with my expertise in adaptations of the human form and function for walking on two legs. And so I spent a lot of time with footprints of humans and non-human primates, and always have had an interest in animal tracking. And so I had that expertise to bring to bear, and thought I could say or could offer some important insights, build upon what had been done. My predecessor, Dr. Grover Krantz, was also a physical anthropologist, and so he knew a great deal about anatomy, not so much specifically, or not as much specifically, I shouldn't say it that way, as it relates to bipedalism, but he certainly made some very important and interesting observations, many of which I concur with, some of which have served as good springboards to generate somewhat different interpretations of the evidence, and produce a model of the Sasquatch foot that is quite revealing, and says a lot about the prospects of these things being simply hoaxes. Somebody with carved wooden feet strapped to their boots, tromping in the woods or down a logging road. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
So you are a Bigfoot believer, correct?
I don't like to use the word believe because it has such a connotation. The ideological skeptics use it as a very pejorative label. They say that you're a true believer, therefore you're no longer objective, you're no longer critical in your thinking. So rather than say believe, which connotes kind of a position of faith and acceptance of something in the absence of evidence, I say I'm convinced on the basis of the evidence that at the very least this is a worthy scientific question. Whether it's resolved or not, in my mind, is beside the point. But on a personal note, I'm absolutely convinced. I'm as convinced, short of having stood and seen one myself. I've found footprints in the field, which for me are every bit as convincing as if I had seen the footprint maker standing there in the woods. So yes, I'm convinced.
All right, well said.
So if you're convinced, what do you think it would take to change the collective belief on the opinion
Right.
that, Bigfoot's kind of just like a mythological sort of urban legend kind of thing?
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
what do you think it would take for more people to be convinced that he's actually real?
Well, the conventions of science demand that a type specimen be provided before any novel species is acknowledged or recognized. And so that means a sufficiently diagnostic piece of, or an entire body, has to be acquired in order to establish that taxon, to establish a description and diagnosis that recognizes it, that differentiates it from other animals. So short of that, I mean, we have lots of other types of evidence. You know, I mentioned the stories. I mentioned Roger Patterson's film. So there's photographics, there's anecdotes, there's the footprints, there's hair samples that defy attribution to other forms of wildlife. We're hoping that eventually we'll get DNA, and that's probably the next best thing. There is actually a growing discussion in the scientific literature about the whether it's justified in the case of rare and endangered species to recognize a novel species on the basis of DNA alone, rather than require the lethal collection of a type specimen. And especially in an animal like a large-bodied ape, you know, with very few numbers, presumably, and a complex social structure, it's quite problematic to take a specimen. We have this out here with wolves. Oh, we'll just allow the harvesting of a couple of wolves. Well, you shoot an alpha male wolf of a pack, and you don't just harvest a single individual. You disrupt that entire pack, can throw it into disarray, and can potentially impact the survivability of that entire group. And so there's a lot more implication than the simple selectively taking a single individual. So my efforts in the field have been to try to collect hair or skin or blood through various snares and snags and so forth, to see if we could get DNA evidence. And my most recent initiative, I've been developing a collaboration with a couple of other molecular biologists, is to collect samples for eDNA analysis, to actually what we call environmental DNA, where you can take soil samples or water samples from the environment, and DNA actually persists out there that is shed in bodily fluids. Even breathing sheds DNA of the individual. And then there are now techniques that have been developed for extracting that from these samples. And so we've had a challenge with the hair samples in getting DNA, because one of the characteristics of the hair is a lack of a cellular medulla, that central core that has the dead stacked hair cells. In the absence of those, there's precious little DNA in the keratin shaft, which is mostly just extracellular protein. So anyway, I don't mean to ramble on that side of it, but that back to your initial question, that's what it's going to take, and a change of attitude. I mean, basically, that's like hitting them with a 2x4, because there is so much suggestive evidence that goes beyond the urban legends and the myths, that many are very biased against. I mean, the attitude simply is, it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist. I've actually had a colleague who said that to us indirectly through an editor who was forced to reject a paper that he had solicited us to write. And in the end, she and some members of the scientific advisory board for that journal said, actually a magazine for the California Academy of Sciences, that's what she said. She said they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence they think they have. So I mean, that's, you've a priori made up your mind from the outset, and have totally closed your mind, therefore, to the possibility of considering any evidence to the contrary, which is, in my opinion, about the most unscientific attitude you can adopt.
Yeah. All right. So
yeah.
on that topic, do you think that we'll see this kind of definitive, like irrefutable proof sometime soon?
Well, it's hard to say because there are only a few people really that are out there systematically and in an organized fashion looking for that evidence. And so it's going to be probably by happenstance. I suspect, I mean, I envision two scenarios, you know, either someone like me who goes out and harvests samples and finds the DNA. That will be one way to at least tip the scales. I mean, as we discussed, that may not be sufficient to ultimately conclusively demonstrate. It may be challenged. Alternately, it'll be purely by happenstance. Somebody will walk in with a tooth or a jaw or a femur of something they pick up in a stream bed or in a cave, or a truck driver, you know, on a remote mountain highway will hit one, and somebody will stop and collect the corpse, or a hunter shoot one, you know, or something like that. But again, there's no way to know when or if such an event will occur. So I don't know. I can't put a timeline. I mean, I've had, you know, colleagues now who have come and gone, have passed, hoping that they would be alive long enough to see this question resolved. And unfortunately, it hasn't happened in their lifetimes. And, you know, here I'm just turned 62. I'm getting up there myself, and hope that I'm still around long enough to or participate in the discovery, but we'll see.
So just to expand on that a little bit, would like one bone or like one, just like a single piece of evidence be enough to extrapolate like the existence of a whole thing, similar to like how Gigantopithecus, for example, there's like
Right.
Very few, I think, bone samples, like they had the jaw and the teeth,
Right.
but you could still, you know, see that there was a whole species of ape from that.
Right, exactly. If that requires that whatever bone or, you know, piece you have is sufficiently diagnostic. And in the case of Gigantopithecus, you know, teeth have long been the basis for much of our taxonomy of animals, and so especially mammals. And so finding a tooth, a collection of teeth, and there's about a couple thousand Gigantopithecus teeth, and a couple, just one or just a couple, two jaws really of Gigantopithecus blackie. But that's enough. You're right, that's enough. And I mean, that should be a lesson though too, the rarity of those remains. Were it not for those very few scraps of bone, you know, if someone said, you know, I think that there's a good chance that there was a giant ape alive during the latter Pleistocene in China, one that could have stood 9 feet tall and weighed 1,200 pounds. People, you know, would just laugh them off. You know, it's King Kong. You're just making up King Kong story. But with those, it just takes those few bones to establish that. And so that's why I say if somebody walked in, so every time someone brings me a bone, I get excited. But so far, it's not been a bone from a large ape.
So you touched on it a little bit with when you talked about the wolf packs. There are some sightings of Bigfoot. You know, most of them are solitary. They see one animal, but there are other incidences, such as the Ape Canyon attacks, where there's groups of them.
Right.
What is the working theory of what a Sasquatch collective or society would look like?
Right. Well, even the Ape Canyon incident you mentioned, it requires. I mean, I think there were some assumptions made and maybe some embellishment. The miners never claimed to have ever seen more than one at a time, and they shot one, which presumably tumbled into the canyon, and then they you know, the stories about their cabin being assailed. Of course, it very easily invokes visions of hordes of apes pitching boulders onto the cabin of the roof of this hapless cabin. And again, it could have been only one or two individuals that pursued that, the miners in that cabin. Anyway, most evidence that we have, be it footprint finds or be it eyewitness encounters, are of solitary individuals, by far and away the majority. Or the next being what we think are females with offspring. And we have examples of infant footprints, you know, that are only a few inches long in the company of what appears to be a female. So for me, that combined with the distribution patterns that begin to sort of take shape or emerge from the repeat appearance of recognizable sets of footprints, a recognizable individual leaving multiple footprints, suggests that they have a fairly large home range of about 1,000 square miles, give or take. I mean, that's just a very rough approximation, which obviously is going to vary depending on the habitat and terrain and topography, etc. And I suspect that they probably have something that's similar to an orangutan, a social structure we refer to as a noyu, where the male dominates an area, a territory. He doesn't dominate a harem, but rather a territory, and that territory encompasses the home ranges of several females. Those females and their offspring, you know, are go about their business separately, unless the female is receptive to mating. And so in the case of an orangutan, for example, that only happens every 4 to 8 years. And when they are then in heat, they will seek out the dominant male, the large male that can advertise his dominance and presence and keep the other males at bay. And I kind of think, I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that sort of a pattern. For example, in Northern California, where Patty, Patterson, the Patterson-Gimlin film subject was observed, there was also a large male. And he left a footprint that was 16 to 17 inches and much broader than hers. I assume it's a male based on the size and the robusticity, the breadth. Whereas the females, like Patty, have a much more gracile foot outline, with the sides more parallel instead of quite flaring. And they are considerably smaller, a couple of inches smaller. So there are some situations where we have evidence that suggests that's a pretty good model, a working model, at least a null hypothesis for now. But solitary behavior seems to be the rule rather than the exception.
All right, so going back to what you were talking about with the footprints, how do you determine like if footprints are real or fake?
Right. Or
like, how do you like kind of see similarities between footprints in different areas?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, a great deal has to do with the context. It's much easier to try to ascertain the credibility of a footprint find if the discoverer has documented the site well. And you know, when someone just shows up with a single isolated footprint cast, it's a little more problematic unless they're very clear. And you know, a lot of the examples you see publicized are the best examples, and those are a bit rare. You know, it's hard to leave. There aren't a lot of surfaces out there, with the exception of dusty, you know, Forest Service or logging roads or stream banks, sandbars and such, where there's enough soft substrate to take a footprint and hold the detail. If that detail is present, then we're looking for several things. Obviously, you know, we're looking for a footprint that's bigger than human on average. Now, obviously, they're not born big, so there's going to be some smaller ones, and I have a whole, you know, size range. But that large size eliminates first the possibility of misidentification of, say, a human or a bear track, for example. Then we look for other features like the tremendous breadth that the footprints tend to show. And from fairly large, substantial samples of what I think are credible examples, if you plot, you know, breadth to length ratios on a bivariate plot, humans and Sasquatch separate out quite distinctly. Even if you scale them so that they're as ratios, so that they're dimensionless, The Sasquatch are distinct because their feet are so much broader, which is a function of their mass, their large size. You know, the volume of an organism increases to the third power, to the cube, whereas the two-dimensional, the surface area, only increases to the square of those dimensions. And so for the foot sole, the plantar surface of the foot, to kind of keep pace with this increasing body mass, they have to be disproportionately wide and have more contact with the ground. Hence, that brings to another important distinction. Humans are characterized by a very evident longitudinal arch. The Sasquatch foot is archless, it's flat, and has a very flexible midfoot, whereas ours is stiffened to help support that arch. Theirs is quite flexible, and it gives them a lot more maneuverability in very steep, uneven terrain. Got ahead of myself. Humans have evolved for moving on rather flat, open terrain. We can get around in the mountains, but we're not as well as something like a chimpanzee or a gorilla and or a Sasquatch. So those are some of the major differences. There's other subtleties in the proportions of the toes and the angle of the toe row and such. Obviously the ability to flare the toes, to extend them and flare. Humans, that brings up another one. Humans, because of shoe wear, their toes tend to be quite compressed. And in fact, the little toe is sometimes turned completely on its side. And you even get the toe pads sometimes pressed so tightly together. You know, if you ever get a box of grapes or a crate of grapes that have been packed in real tight for a period of time and you take them out, they don't look like little globular grapes, but they look kind of like cubes with edges that have been pressed in. Your toes are just like that. Sometimes you can feel on your little toe that calloused little ridge that runs across the pad. And those things will show up. They'll transfer to footprints. I've had cases where people have brought me in examples, and sometimes they're pretty impressive in size. I've had one that was 13 inches long, but the guy had a very Okay.
And yeah, okay, let's go.
All right, I'll start us off again. You know, all around the world, you've got Yeti, Yowie, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk ape, right? There's sightings all over the world. Do you believe these are different subspecies of the same overarching species, or would they be different species of great ape?
I think they're different species of great ape or even hominin, members of our immediate family. One of the things that we've learned in the past several decades is that human evolution, rather than proceeding in a rather single file march with one lineage leading to us, we now know that it's a remarkably bushy family tree, and new species are constantly being added to it. I mean, you know, I had a slide that I was using back from 2007 and that showed the phylogeny. And, you know, I tell the viewers that this is now obsolete, by the way. I would need to add at least 5, maybe as many as 7 new species, depending on how you split hairs and debates about recognition of species. So a very bushy tree, and then on top of that, the acknowledgement that some of those branches have persisted until far more recently than ever would have been imagined before. The discovery that really drove that message home, finally, was the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, here suddenly we've got what can only be now accepted as a very early Homo, like Homo habilis, barely different than a late Australopithecine in its postcranial anatomy. And yet it's less than 50,000 years old. So how did they, you know, what has happened between East Africa 2 to 2.5 million years ago and East Asia 50,000 years ago? There's a lot of the story we don't understand. We've got examples of Homo erectus that are as young as 25,000 years. We've got Homo heidelbergensis in East Asia that's 20 to 25,000 years. We've got Neanderthals that are anywhere from 10 to 20,000 years old. Now we've got Denisovans and you know, possibly the other mystery, which might be Homo heidelbergensis, but mystery species. Why would we think, in the face of so much evidence that indicates in the past the rule was multiple species coexisting across the landscape, why would we think that now we're the only ones left when there still are all these reports of Yeti and Yowie and Yeren and Sasquatch, etc.? So, and what's interesting, you know, and you made a point, and just let me emphasize that they aren't found all over the world. You know, there's no sightings from the middle of the Sahara Desert. There's an ecological basis for the distribution of sightings, and certainly there is some cultural overtones and movement, you know, that influenced by the movement of populations that take their racial or ethnic memories with them when they move. But for the most part, these are wild men of the woods, and the stories are associated with montane forest ecosystems, and you know, that's significant. I think it's, if there's a biological ecological basis for these creatures, that's more than just simply a mythological figure or a, you know, an archetype, an icon of the human psyche, manifestation of the human psyche.
Yeah, so to expand on that a little bit, how would you distinguish evidence between like either being like a great ape or a hominin?
Right. Well, the benchmark has been, up until quite recently, bipedalism. That was seen as the distinguishing adaptation that differentiated the hominin lineages, branches. Now that boundary, that simple dichotomy, has kind of gotten a little blurry. I mean, to advocate that Ardipithecus ramidus is an early hominin when it has a skeleton that's hardly differentiated from any of the other Miocene apes. If it is indeed a hominin ancestor, then we're going to have to think about non-bipedal hominins. Maybe bipedalism didn't emerge until that split had already occurred for some time. Or, on the other hand, it's very possible that bipedalism evolved convergently in other lineages, like maybe Gigantopithecus. I mean, when you're a giant ape, you can't spend your time up in the trees because a fall is fatal. And if you're a temperate ape, inhabiting temperate forests, pine forests, and deciduous forests, most of the fruits that you're after aren't up in the trees, especially if it's a coniferous forest. They're the fruits, the sugar content that you're after is in berries and on shrubs in the understory. And so when you're down on the ground and you're that big and you're that heavy, there are certain constraints in a primate that has evolved the manual dexterity, the upper limb mobility that we have. Having our shoulder blade on our back, and this is getting a little technical, but you know, having the shoulder blade on the back so that when we're on all fours, it meets our upper limb bone, our humerus, at an angle instead of being aligned for compression, that's a problem. That puts shearing stresses on the joints as well as at the elbow and the wrist that are a problem. You know, sometimes people have real trouble doing push-ups because it causes pain in their wrist, and it's easier to do a push-up on either holding on to those hand supports to do a push-up, or to, like I do, just do it on the backs of my knuckles so that my wrist stays straight. That's a manifestation of the flexibility that we have due to hand gripping and arm hanging, as opposed to walking on all fours like monkeys do, for example. So my point of that is all those problems become amplified when you're 1,200 pounds. And so if you do come to the ground, you know, there's only two ways to get around. You're either doing it on all fours like a gorilla or a chimp, or you do it bipedally. So bipedalism could have emerged independently and convergently in another lineage like Gigantopithecus, and it's not necessarily a very close hominin affiliate. So either way, it's you know, you'll bump into arguments out there on the internet and so forth. There, many of my non-professional acquaintances take exception to my discussion of this. They basically boil it down to apes have a divergent big toe, humans don't. So since Sasquatch doesn't, it's a human. Well, my humanity doesn't reside in my big toe and its position relative to the other toes. It resides in a lot of other characteristics. And so we see a broad range of toe morphology in apes and early hominins. And so that's not a very good argument, in my opinion. It's one element, but it's not the end-all element.
All right. A while back, you were featured in the History Channel show Ancient Aliens.
Yeah.
You didn't really speak on if you believe Bigfoot had connections to aliens, but you rather gave contextual information about Bigfoot. Looking back on the show, what are your thoughts?
Well, I always, those kind of opportunities basically boils down for me. If I'm too choosy about where I'll talk, then they'll just get someone else, someone who may be much less qualified to offer something to the audience that's thoughtful and informative and accurate, scientifically accurate. So even though it can come back to bite me sometimes, I do speak to those audiences and have had good experiences overall. I personally don't think there's any connection between the two. I think what connections have been suggested are purely coincidental. I mean, there's a bear in the woods too. So you're going to explain the presence of the bear by citing UFO sightings as well. It's that kind of an argument, in my opinion. I just don't see anything and have not experienced anything personally that would suggest a paranormal aspect to Sasquatch. As you can tell by the answers I've been giving so far, our discussion, I see it as a biological entity, and I think its anatomies and behaviors are absolutely consistent with a large hominoid, be it ape or hominin. It still is. I don't have to, resort to interdimensional portals and UFOs and time travel and shape shifting and all those kinds of things. As interesting as they would be, I mean, wouldn't rule it out, but that's the science. Occam's razor is often misapplied or misinterpreted. Parsimony does not say that the simplest explanation is more likely to be true. It simply says that until you can reject a simpler explanation, you're not justified to elaborate and make more complicated explanations. And so far, the simplest explanation in my mind is that it's a biological species, just like any other out there. It's just very rare and elusive and has not been discovered in the fossil record directly, unless Gigantopithecus is an ancestor. It very well could be that, but otherwise we just don't have the evidence. But that doesn't alone justify us to leap to fanciful explanations.
All right. So kind of on a similar note, there's a lot of myths of these ape-like creatures or like wild men.
Right.
For example, just in the Northwest specifically, you have the Zunaqua or the Buckwis,
exactly,
among a lot of others. So how do these stories factor into modern research, or how you look at evidence?
Well, I think that they are interesting and worthy of research on their own merits. The presence of such a figure so uniformly throughout these cultures that reside in the ecological areas, the forests, the mountains and forests of the various continents, is, in my opinion, a very persuasive piece of evidence I mean, cryptozoology is an interesting discipline in that many of the discoveries of unexpected species have occurred after the explorers or the field zoologists have listened to the stories, the accounts of the native peoples. I mean, many people who, even modern conservationists, when they go into an area and they want to very rapidly compile a catalog of the animals of the region, what do? They ask, who's the best hunter in the village? And then they ask them, what animals do you see in the woods? And what's interesting, there was actually a survey, a study that was done on that, with that method in Southeast Asia. And so frequently, just matter-of-factly, was mentioned a little hairy person, like the orang pendek descriptions, that the authors actually included that in their catalog. And they put a footnote and said, we realize that this is going to be rejected or scoffed at by many of the readers of this article, but it was cited with such consistency and such or so consistently and with such consistency of description that we felt obligated to include it in our catalog. So for that reason, I think it's important to give note to those. The interpretation of that kind of, or not that kind, but the more cultural, like the Zonaqua and the Bukwas. For example, I've talked to Native Americans who are just matter of fact, well, yes, that's what you call the Sasquatch. Then there are others who quibble a bit and say, well, you know, the Bukwas and the Zonaqua are two completely different things. The Bukwas are these pasty-skinned creatures, ghost-like things that come about when someone dies at sea, and they come out of the ocean and they frequent and haunt the forest. You know, so it's hard to know for sure, but boy, you know, when you have a depiction of a Bukwas and it has all those distinguishing characteristics, the receding chin, the very large distance between the mouth and the nose, flaring nostrils, sunken eyes and heavy brows and receding forehead and shock of hair and squared off teeth with no canines projecting. I think what can happen is the image is based on encounters with the Sasquatch, but in efforts to explain these man-like creatures, one way of accounting for them is that they are lost people lost at sea, people lost in the woods that have changed, or you know, one argument was that they were shaman that were out in the woods to study and to, you know, go through their vigil, and in the process transformed into a Sasquatch. Well, I think those are all just so stories after the fact, but at the root of those stories are these real biological entities. I mean, they do the same thing with other animals. You know, lots of their stories are about animals that have personalities, that have certain personality traits, that can talk. You know, you've got the coyotes that's the trickster and always getting in trouble and trying to rip off somebody or another. You know, that doesn't make the coyote any less a biological entity, nor do they think of them any less as a biological entity. So it's a whole fascinating area to consider, but I think if Sasquatch does exist, let me rephrase that. Assuming for a moment that Sasquatch does exist, we would naturally expect it to show up in the cultural stories and lore in the manner that it does, not the other way around, that the fact that it's in the lore lessens the likelihood that it's real. I think it's just the opposite. And you know, like I said, the same argument can be made for so many other animals, all the animals for that matter.
Yeah. All right.
So deforestation, habitat loss, it's a big issue facing all animals.
Sure.
As as our presence into the woods expands, we deforest and we expand our cities. How will this change the outlook of Bigfoot populations and maybe increased sightings?
Right. Well, it seems to, well, and you would assume it is indeed having an impact. There was actually an interesting study that was done by an acquaintance of mine who was a student at the University of Colorado and was majoring in geographic information systems. He did his senior thesis on Sasquatch with applying GIS technologies, and his thesis was, his question was, what was the geospatial impact on the distribution of Sasquatch reports in the Pacific Northwest over a 20-year period, correlating it with the expansion of the Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, Vancouver metropolitan areas. And he demonstrated a significant impact on a correlation on that distribution with a shift to higher elevation and more southerly latitude in relation to both of those metropolitan areas, which is really quite interesting. So I think in fact, we are having an impact. I mean, it stands to reason. Whether it means there will be more reports and more encounters is hard to say, though, because hand in hand with the habitat degradation, there's a trend over the past 50 years of people recreating less and less in the remote parts of the forests. You know, backpacking was all the rage when I was in high school, and there aren't that many people that go on those trails, not as many as were back then. And most hunters these days, people are not in as good a shape, and so they hunt from four-wheelers, and very few people go into the far back country to hunt. So there's a kind of a pulling back from the back country that certainly has an impact on the reports. It's always hard to judge those kinds of trends or data because they're impacted so heavily by things like social media and the internet and the accessibility to stories and to share your stories and for others to be aware of your stories. Plus the plethora of stories that are becoming less and less substantial or substantiated. So there's more stories about bumps in the night. There's more stories about tree structures and things like that almost, in my mind, have very little, if anything, to do with Sasquatch. The good, solid reports by credible witnesses of encountering a Sasquatch in under good conditions of visibility and or finding good, clear footprints remain quite rare. So hard to know. I mean, you could pick and choose and argue in any number of directions about the impact or the rise or fall of reports. There's just a lot of messy data out there.
All right, so to extend on that a little bit, since there are, so few sightings and the population is so spread out, do you think it's possible that these species could become extinct, like maybe even without us even knowing?
Sure, that's possible. I don't think we're precariously near that point, given the ongoing reports that do trickle in, as few as they might be, relatively few. But anytime you have an animal that has, we talked a little bit about possible social structure, and that certainly has that combined with their life history, has an impact on or it is important for considering their population structure and numbers. And so whenever you have a large-bodied slowly developing, infrequently reproducing organism, they're much more sensitive to impact to their habitat and less resilient if they are extirpated by famine or by disease or such. And so that's a very serious implication of all of this, of our interaction with them. It's even been speculated that just as European contact with the Native American populations was decimating because they had no immunity to so many of the diseases, smallpox and cholera and measles and such, primates, many of the higher primates, are likewise susceptible to those diseases, tuberculosis, for example. And the fact that they are solitary, it works to their advantage. They're less likely to spread such communicable diseases rapidly and widely. But nevertheless, it's been suggested that just as the Native American populations fell precipitously, there may have been a bottleneck for Sasquatch as well, as European settlers came to the west and elsewhere. I mean, there was immigration from China and Asia as well, other parts of Asia as well. So I can't remember what your original question was. Just the impact of human.
Yeah.
Yeah, whether they're on the verge of extinction. Yeah, I think that's something that we certainly should bear in mind. The problem with those kinds of conversations is, everyone who's made any kind of attempt, either feigned or sincere, to get them protected, and however one would do that, it falls on its face because it's just becomes a joke. Why would any legislative body seriously undertake such action in the absence of any definitive proof that such a creature exists? I mean, there was one time an instance where a environmental impact report was turned in, and under the possible species impacted, they listed Sasquatch, and it was done just kind of as a tongue-in-cheek, but it got all kinds of flack from various quarters that a serious report would be, would incorporate such just a jocular gesture like that. I mean, it wasn't entirely tongue-in-cheek. The people may have had, personal convictions, and they may have felt that it was just a way to kind of draw attention to the potential that there are species yet to be discovered in these impacted and imperiled habitats. But nevertheless, can become quite a either controversial or ridiculed undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, just to wrap it up,
okay.
Is there anything else you think we should know about Bigfoot?
Oh, gee. Let's see. After I prattle on for so long, it's hard to think of what I haven't. And I think we touched on a lot of the significant aspects. Your questions were good and they covered quite a broad spectrum of both the science and the cultural aspects, the societal aspects that influence the search for research into these types of questions. I mean, a lot of times people are so focused on their own research and are so conservative in their approach to science that they don't allow for the possibility that there are things like this out there. I mean, if it was out, I had a department chairman who, he's an endocrinologist, but he's also a lifelong resident of Idaho, and his retort to me was, I'm born and raised in Idaho. I've hunted and fished all across the state. If it was out there, I would have seen it. I thought, wow, that's quite the assumption on your part, that anything out there to be seen, you've seen it. He's the same individual who said to me, well, after all, Jeff, these are just stories. And again, this lack of a scientific attitude. I said, well, stories that potentially leave footprints, that shed hair, that void scat, that vocalize, that are witnessed by credible witnesses, that, I said, I think it's a little more than just stories. And, he would have nothing to do with it. Or then I run into the people. I gave a talk at University of Wyoming, and we got to lose it. Anyway, I'll tell you that story another time. All right. Well, thanks. It's been my pleasure to chat with you. And
thanks.
For the thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Good luck with your project.
Thank you.
Good luck with your search.
Thank you.